That's what the Gospel of Matthew says. But what if the fruits of Jesus' own words show something much darker than what people want to believe? For 2,000 years, Jesus has been portrayed as the ultimate symbol of kindness, love, and sacrifice. His words have been quoted endlessly from pulpits, embroidered on banners, and repeated as if they were the height of wisdom. But when you actually read what he said, without the filter of church tradition or centuries of romanticized retelling, a very different picture starts to appear. Some of his sayings don't sound like guidance from a wise teacher at all. They sound like the commands of someone running a high-control group. They fit the very patterns that sociologists and psychologists point out when they describe cult leaders. And when you line them up one after another, the image of Jesus as a gentle sage starts to collapse under the weight of his own words. So, let's take a closer look. Not at what people claim about him, not at how his words have been dressed up to sound poetic and profound, but at the raw statements attributed to him in the Gospels. These 10 passages show a Jesus who demanded unquestioning loyalty, divided families, threatened punishment, and called for extreme devotion that stripped people of their independence. The first troubling thing Jesus said shows up when he told his followers that if anyone came to him and did not hate their own father, mother, wife, children, brothers, sisters, and even their own life, they could not be his disciple. That's in Luke 14:26. Think about that. Hate your family, hate your life, or you're not worthy to follow him. Now, defenders of this verse usually argue that hate doesn't mean actual hate. They'll say it was just an exaggerated way of saying, love me more than your family. But either way, what's left is a demand for total allegiance. That's the very essence of cult control. Separate people from their families, from their support systems, and make loyalty to the leader the ultimate priority. Every expert on cult dynamics recognizes this as one of the classic red flags. And it's not just theory. Throughout history, movements that took this teaching seriously tore apart households. Missionaries in the early church bragged about converts abandoning their spouses and children for the cause. In more recent times, groups patterned on the same mindset have led people to cut ties with their parents, their friends, and anyone who didn't submit. This is how you isolate someone and reshape their entire identity around one figure. And it all starts with the command to despise everything else. The second disturbing teaching is found in Matthew 10:34, where Jesus says, I did not come to bring peace, but a sword. He goes on to explain that his mission would turn family members against each other, a man against his father, a daughter against her mother, and so on. That's not a metaphor. That's a direct claim that his message would split households down the middle. It's not hard to see how damaging that is. Religion thrives when it divides people into us versus them. And here, Jesus himself is celebrating division as proof of loyalty to him. Again, this isn't the picture of a peacemaker or healer. It's the rhetoric of someone who sees fractured families as evidence of faithfulness. The more people fight over him, the more his words are proven true. That's self-fulfilling manipulation at its finest. A third example appears in Mark 9:43, where Jesus tells people that if their hand causes them to sin, they should cut it off. Better to enter life maimed, he says, than to go into hell with 2 hands. The same with eyes and feet. Of course, many preachers rush in to explain that he didn't really mean self-mutilation, but then why use such horrifying language? Why tie morality to images of tearing yourself apart? This is the kind of fear-inducing speech that conditions people to see themselves as broken, guilty, and desperate for salvation only he can offer. Psychologists studying religious trauma often point to these kinds of extreme teachings as seeds of shame and self-harm. Even if not taken literally, they lodge deep in the mind and create a warped view of human worth. If every mistake is so catastrophic that you'd be better off maiming yourself, how can anyone ever feel whole? It's the exact opposite of healthy guidance. The fourth shocking saying is in Matthew 8:22. A man tells Jesus he wants to follow him, but first he needs to bury his father. Jesus replies, "Let the dead bury their own dead." In other words, leave your grieving family behind, ignore your obligations, and prioritize me. Again, this is cult logic. Devalue the normal responsibilities of life, even sacred ones like burying your parent, and redirect every ounce of loyalty toward the leader's mission. When you put yourself in that man's shoes, the cruelty of it becomes clear. He wasn't asking to run away from responsibility. He just wanted to honor his Father in death. But Jesus brushed it off as meaningless compared to following him. That's not compassion. That's control masked as spiritual urgency. The fifth disturbing teaching is found in Matthew 25, in the parable of the sheep and goats. Here, Jesus describes the final judgment, where he separates people into the blessed and the cursed. Those on the cursed side are told to depart into eternal fire. This image of everlasting torment has been used for centuries to terrify people into obedience, and it all comes directly from his mouth in this parable. Now, you might hear modern Christians say, well, hell isn't really fire, it's just separation from God. But the text doesn't say that. The text describes eternal punishment contrasted with eternal life. And whatever form you imagine it takes, the underlying message is clear: obey or burn forever. That is the textbook definition of coercion. When you step back and look at that picture, it's striking how often Jesus relies on fear. Not just fear of missing out or fear of being wrong, but fear of eternal pain, fear of rejection, fear of abandonment by family and community. This is the foundation of control, not the foundation of wisdom. The sixth disturbing statement comes from Matthew 19:29, where Jesus tells his followers that anyone who has left houses, brothers, sisters, father, mother, wife, children, or lands for his sake will receive 100-fold and inherit eternal life. Once again, the idea is clear. Sacrifice everything, walk away from everyone, and he'll reward you later. This isn't encouragement for balanced living. It's the promise of future compensation if you're willing to give up your present life. That kind of thinking has fueled countless destructive movements. People surrender their wealth, their time, their relationships, even their basic happiness, because they've been promised something far greater just around the corner. But the reward never actually comes. Instead, they've traded a real life for loyalty to an abstract dream. The seventh troubling passage is in John 15:6, where Jesus says, "If anyone does not remain in me, he is thrown away like a branch and withers. Such branches are picked up, thrown into the fire, and burned." This is exclusion and punishment wrapped up in a neat metaphor. Stay connected to him or be discarded and destroyed. This isn't the language of freedom, it's the logic of dependency. In cult psychology, leaders often stress that the group is the only safe place. Step outside, and you'll be lost, doomed, or ruined. That's exactly what's happening here. The threat of fire becomes a leash around the mind of anyone tempted to think for themselves. The eighth statement is in Matthew 7:21-23. Jesus warns that not everyone who calls him Lord will enter the kingdom of heaven. Even those who preach, heal, or do wonders in his name might be rejected. He ends with the chilling line, "I never knew you. Depart from me, you evildoers." Think about the psychological trap in that. Even total devotion might not be enough. Even if you give everything, sacrifice your family, mutilate your desires, and cling to him, there's still a chance he'll say, "Not good enough." That's spiritual blackmail of the highest order. It ensures people will never feel secure, never feel at peace, and will always push themselves further into the system. Because what if they're the ones rejected? The ninth troubling teaching comes from Matthew 12:30, where Jesus says, "Whoever is not with me is against me." That's absolutism. There's no middle ground, no neutrality, no space for people to live their own way. If you're not fully committed, you're an enemy. This all or nothing thinking is a hallmark of authoritarian movements. It divides the world neatly into insiders and outsiders. And once people accept that logic, it justifies hostility, judgment, even violence against those deemed against the group. Finally, the 10th, and maybe the most haunting, is in Luke 19:27, in the parable of the minas. After telling a story about servants and a nobleman, Jesus ends with a line attributed to the nobleman, but placed in his mouth as the teacher. "But those enemies of mine who did not want me to be king over them, bring them here and kill them in front of me." Some apologists rush to say, well, that's just a parable, it's symbolic. But the symbolism itself is shocking. The story paints rebellion as deserving of slaughter and places the command for execution in the voice of the authority figure. Even if it's just a story, Why use murder as the punchline? Why normalize killing dissenters, even metaphorically, if your aim is compassion? Across all these passages, the pattern becomes undeniable. Jesus didn't simply teach kindness or wisdom. He demanded absolute loyalty, used fear as a weapon, encouraged division, and justified extreme sacrifice in exchange for promises that could never be verified. That's not the profile of a teacher who liberated people. That's the profile of a cult leader who bound people to himself with a mixture of fear and reward. And when we look at history, we see the real-world consequences. Families torn apart, wars fought in his name, generations taught to fear eternal punishment, and lives spent in guilt and sacrifice instead of freedom and joy. These aren't just abstract sayings. They've shaped entire cultures, and they've justified suffering on a massive scale. When you look at these 10 sayings together, you start to see a structure, a framework that lines up almost point for point with what researchers describe when they analyze destructive groups. There's the demand for exclusive loyalty, the dismissal of family bonds, the threat of punishment for leaving, the constant fear of not measuring up, the promise of special rewards for those who give up everything. It's all there. Psychologists studying cults often point to a model known as the BITE framework. It stands for behavior, information, thought, and emotional control. Leaders who want total devotion work by controlling what you do, what you know, how you think, and how you feel. Jesus' teachings, when stripped of the comforting church spin, fit this model almost eerily well. Behavior control shows up in the extreme commands. Give up your family, leave behind your dead parent, cut off your own hand if it causes you to sin. These aren't calls for balance. They're calls for drastic action that reshape daily life. Information control appears in the idea that only his words are the truth, that if you're not with him, you're against him. Outsiders can't be trusted because they're automatically enemies. That narrows the field of knowledge, just like a cult leader who tells his followers not to listen to critics or outside voices. Thought control comes through the constant framing of doubt as rebellion. If you even question him, you risk being the branch thrown into the fire, or the servant cast out. That internal policing forces followers to shut down their own questions before they can even surface. And emotional control might be the strongest of all. The endless use of guilt and fear, the looming threat of eternal fire, the insecurity of possibly hearing, "I never knew you." These are levers pulled directly on the heart, designed to keep people anxious, devoted, and dependent. When you map Jesus' sayings onto that framework, you realize this isn't just a coincidence. It's the same toolkit used by cult leaders across time. And it's why so many people, even centuries later, still live with the psychological scars of these teachings. History bears this out. The early church praised converts who abandoned their families to follow the movement. Martyrs were celebrated not just for dying, but for leaving behind children, spouses, and parents. The radical devotion Jesus demanded wasn't just theoretical. It was put into practice, tearing apart lives in the process. And when Christianity grew into an empire-backed institution, those same sayings were wielded to justify persecution and war. If "whoever is not with me is against me," then entire nations could be branded enemies of Christ and crushed. If "bring them here and kill them in front of me" was in the sacred text, then violence against dissenters wasn't just allowed, it was sanctified. Even today, the echoes remain. Families split apart when one member leaves the faith. Children disowned for refusing to conform. People trapped in cycles of guilt, convinced they can never be good enough. These aren't rare stories. They're happening every day, and the roots trace back to the words themselves. What makes it even more striking is how the image of Jesus as gentle and loving has been so carefully polished over time. Churches highlight the softer sayings, "Love your neighbor, turn the other cheek," while downplaying or twisting the harsher ones. They'll insist that "hate your family" doesn't really mean hate, that "bring them here and kill them" is just a metaphor, that "cut off your hand" is symbolic. But think about it. If we had a modern leader who said those exact things, would we excuse them so easily? If someone today told their followers to hate their parents, abandon funerals, and cut off body parts, we wouldn't call them wise. We'd call them dangerous. Yet when the same words are in the Bible, They're treated as holy. That's the power of tradition. Centuries of repetition dull the edges. People grow up hearing these verses read in calm, reverent tones. They're embedded in sermons, children's lessons, stained glass windows. By the time someone is old enough to really hear what they're saying, the shock has been smoothed away. But the underlying logic is still there, shaping thought and behavior. And that's why it matters to revisit them with clear eyes, to strip away the layers of translation, commentary, and spin, and hear the raw words for what they are. Because when you do, it becomes impossible to ignore the cult-like structure sitting at the core of the teachings. One of the most effective ways to see these sayings clearly is to compare them with what we know about modern cult leaders. Because when you line up the words side by side, the similarities are too close to ignore. Take Jim Jones, for example, the leader of the People's Temple. He demanded his followers cut off ties with family, surrender their money, and devote every aspect of their lives to him. When critics raised concerns, he told members not to listen, that outsiders couldn't be trusted. And when people started to doubt, he tightened control by threatening them with punishment, either from him or from a hostile world outside the group. Now, think about Jesus' words. Hate your family, leave the dead to bury their own. Whoever isn't with me is against me. Obey or burn in eternal fire. The playbook is nearly identical. Only one has been condemned by history as a manipulative cult leader, and the other has been sanctified as the Son of God. Or look at David Koresh, who led the Branch Davidians in Waco. He insisted he alone had the truth, that loyalty to him mattered more than loyalty to family or law. He promised eternal reward for those who stayed faithful. He demanded absolute devotion, even when it meant giving up children or spouses. And the result was catastrophic: death, trauma, and lives shattered. When people hear about Koresh, they shake their heads and wonder how anyone could fall for it. Yet, when the same patterns appear in the words of Jesus, they're wrapped in reverence. The difference isn't the message, it's the cultural packaging. Psychologists often talk about bounded choice. That's the state where someone feels like they're making free decisions, but every option has been shaped and restricted by the group. If you stay loyal, you're rewarded. If you leave, you're destroyed. And over time, the person's sense of self shrinks until they can't imagine a life outside the leader's system. That's exactly what Jesus' sayings create. A world where there's no middle ground, no neutral space, no life outside his authority. Follow me and you'll live forever. Leave me and you'll burn. That's not freedom. That's bounded choice at its most powerful. It's also worth noting how often these sayings target the most basic human connections. Family, community, self-preservation. These aren't minor parts of life. They're the foundation of human existence. By demanding loyalty above them, Jesus positioned himself as more important than the deepest bonds people naturally form. That's classic cult behavior, because once you've displaced family and self, there's nothing left but the leader. History gives us endless case studies of what happens when groups follow this formula. The Heaven's Gate movement told members to give up family, possessions, and eventually even their bodies in order to follow their leader into a promised afterlife. The Manson family cut themselves off from the outside world under the spell of a single figure who convinced them the end was near. The Unification Church, also called the Moonies, convinced followers to abandon careers, relationships, and identities in the name of loyalty to their Messiah. Every time, the result is the same: broken families, shattered minds, wasted lives. And yet, when Jesus' words mirror the very same themes, they're treated as divine wisdom. That double standard shows just how deeply tradition can blind people to what's right in front of them. The more you study these sayings, the harder it is to separate them from the long list of destructive movements history has produced. And the more you realize that the cult-like aspects weren't an accident or a misinterpretation. They were baked into the foundation from the beginning. Once you see the cult-like structure in Jesus' own words, the next step is noticing how the early church and later institutions built entire systems around them. The logic of control didn't stay in the abstract. It became a blueprint for how Christianity operated for centuries. Take the command to hate family and prioritize loyalty to him. That teaching set the stage for the church to position itself above all earthly ties. Monks and nuns were praised for abandoning families. Missionaries were celebrated for leaving spouses and children behind to serve the cause. Ordinary believers were told that devotion to the church mattered more than loyalty to their own blood. That pattern is directly rooted in Jesus' demand for absolute allegiance. Or look at the warning that whoever is not with me is against me. That stark division became the church's justification for labeling entire populations as enemies. Pagans, Jews, heretics, Muslims, all could be treated as hostile forces simply because they weren't inside the fold. Wars were fought, crusades launched, and inquisitions carried out under the logic that neutrality was impossible. If you weren't with Christ, you were against Him, and that meant you could be punished. The threat of eternal fire, too, became a powerful weapon for institutional control. Generations were raised to fear hell more than death itself. Priests and pastors wielded that fear to extract obedience, wealth, and submission. Medieval peasants gave their last coins to buy indulgences because the terror of eternal punishment loomed so heavily over them. Families watched loved ones die in dread, convinced that a single unconfessed sin could condemn them forever. All of it can be traced back to Jesus' own parables about judgment and fire. And then there's the parable where enemies are slaughtered before the king. That violent image of dissent crushed with blood became a justification for religious persecution across Europe. From burning heretics at the stake to silencing reformers, the church carried out exactly what the parable described. If you wouldn't bow to the king or to the Christ represented by the church, then your life wasn't safe. The words also reshaped how people viewed themselves. If your hand causes you to sin, cut it off. If your eye leads you astray, pluck it out. Even if not taken literally, that language creates a mindset where the body is a threat and human nature is the enemy. Over centuries, this blossomed into doctrines that demonize desire, sexuality, and the simple pleasures of being human. Entire communities grew up convinced that their own bodies were battlegrounds of sin, and that guilt has left a shadow stretching all the way into the present. The saying about abandoning the burial of one's father shows another side of this logic. The church used that same mindset to justify telling people that their ordinary duties, to family, to work, to community, were secondary to the demands of faith. Time and again, loyalty to the institution was set above loyalty to the people closest to you, and anyone who hesitated could be branded weak, worldly, or even damned. When you step back, you see the pattern repeating at every level. What starts as a saying in the Gospels becomes doctrine. Doctrine becomes culture. Culture becomes law. And over time, societies were reshaped around the demands of loyalty, fear, and submission. What makes this even more striking is how invisible it becomes to those inside. People raised in the system don't notice the weight of the control. The sayings are softened with interpretations, wrapped in tradition, delivered in hymns and ceremonies. But underneath the Polish, the original structure remains intact, and it continues to shape millions of lives today. When you look at these teachings through the lens of psychology, what stands out is how perfectly they exploit the vulnerabilities built into human nature, the very same vulnerabilities that make people susceptible to cults, authoritarian movements, and manipulative relationships. Psychologists have long studied why people obey harmful commands. One of the most famous examples is the Milgram experiment. Ordinary people were instructed to deliver what they thought were painful electric shocks to others, simply because an authority figure told them to. Despite their own discomfort, most participants obeyed all the way to the highest levels. Why? Because the presence of authority overrides natural empathy. People are wired to defer to leaders, even when it goes against their conscience. Now think about Jesus' words. They're not gentle suggestions. They're framed as commands from an ultimate authority, the Son of God Himself. Hate your family, cut off your hand, leave the dead unburied. To disobey isn't just to disagree with a teacher, it's to rebel against the divine. That amplifies obedience to a whole new level, because you're not just letting down a leader, you're supposedly letting down the creator of the universe. Another relevant study is the Stanford prison experiment. Volunteers placed in roles of guards and prisoners quickly slipped into abusive behavior patterns. The roles themselves reshaped their sense of morality. In the same way, Jesus' stark division between insiders and outsiders sets up a moral framework where compassion is conditional. If you're with him, you're worthy. If you're against him, you're an enemy fit for rejection or even destruction. Once that line is drawn, cruelty toward outsiders feels not only justified, but righteous. Group psychology also shows how isolation strengthens control. When people are cut off from family, friends, and outside perspectives, their sense of reality begins to collapse into whatever the leader and the group reinforce. That's why cult leaders often push for severed ties and total loyalty. Jesus' command to hate family and prioritize him is a textbook example of this tactic. By weakening natural support systems, he ensured that followers became dependent on him and the group for identity, meaning, and direction. Fear is another powerful lever. Research shows that fear-based messaging, especially fear of punishment, creates compliance far more effectively than reasoned persuasion. Threatening eternal fire, rejection, or exclusion taps directly into the primal fear of annihilation. It bypasses rational thought and embeds itself in the emotional core of the brain. That's why even people who intellectually doubt these teachings often struggle to fully let them go. The fear lingers long after belief fades. And then there's the promise of reward. Social psychologists talk about variable reinforcement, the same principle that keeps gamblers glued to slot machines. The uncertainty of reward keeps people hooked longer than guaranteed outcomes. Jesus' teachings about eternal life fit that perfectly. Follow me, give everything up, and you'll be rewarded. Beyond imagination. But there's always the lingering doubt. Will I really make it, or will I hear, I never knew you? That uncertainty keeps people striving endlessly, never sure, always hoping, always dependent. Put all these pieces together, and you have a psychological system that's nearly airtight. Authority, isolation, fear, conditional belonging, uncertain reward. It's no surprise that so many people became locked into the movement and that it spread so widely. The methods weren't divine. They were human psychology weaponized for control. And once you recognize that pattern, you start to see how little it differs from any other cult structure in history. What changes isn't the technique. It's the story, the packaging, the timing. But the underlying mechanics are the same. Even today, long after the Gospels were written, the echoes of these 10 sayings continue to shape Christian institutions around the world. You don't have to look far to see their influence in contemporary churches. Consider the pressure to prioritize faith above all else. Many evangelical communities still stress loyalty to church leadership, obedience to doctrine, and submission to authority as signs of true faith. Families are sometimes torn apart when members question church teachings, marry outside the faith, or simply step away. That tension mirrors Jesus' command to hate family and follow him first. The mechanism hasn't changed, only the context has. Megachurches take it a step further. Members are encouraged to give generously, not just a token donation, but a significant portion of their income, with the promise that God will bless them in return. That's the same principle as the ancient promise of eternal life for those who sacrifice everything. Instead of eternal fire, there's the carrot of material blessing, social status, and spiritual assurance. The underlying psychology is identical. Sacrifice, obedience, and dependency create loyalty. Even the fear of judgment remains a tool for control. Sermons frequently emphasize the consequences of sin, the danger of falling away, and the risk of eternal separation from God. While many modern leaders soften the language compared to throw them into the fire, the effect is the same: anxiety, guilt, and self-policing. People are encouraged to constantly evaluate their thoughts and actions, wondering if they're measuring up. That's psychological pressure, pure and simple. And then there's the language of division. Groups that define themselves as true believers versus worldly or lukewarm members are drawing directly from sayings like, "Whoever is not with me is against me." This creates an us versus them mentality, where anyone outside the group is suspect, dangerous, or inferior. The result is a culture that isolates its members emotionally and socially, reinforcing loyalty to the institution. Even when leaders don't explicitly encourage violence, the seeds of authoritarian thinking remain. When the principle is embedded in the text, it shapes expectations, behavior, and morality. Followers grow accustomed to obeying authority unquestioningly, assuming that the leader knows best, and deferring their own judgment to the system. That's exactly what Jesus modeled through his own extreme demands for loyalty and obedience. And it isn't just theory. Countless testimonies from people raised in strict religious households reveal long-term effects that mirror what psychologists see in former cult members. Anxiety, guilt, fear of rejection, inability to trust one's own judgment, and struggles with forming healthy relationships are common. Even decades later, the mental patterns instilled by early teachings persist. The real power of these 10 sayings isn't in the actions they demand. It's in the mindset they cultivate. Absolute loyalty, prioritization of the leader over all else, fear of punishment, division of community, and constant self-scrutiny. These are exactly the mental and emotional states that make people vulnerable to long-term control. And they all originate in the words attributed to Jesus. This isn't to say that everyone who follows Christianity experiences this as extreme control. Many people reinterpret, soften, or ignore these passages, and many derive comfort from their faith. But the potential for abuse, manipulation, and psychological pressure is baked directly into the text itself. That's the danger that is rarely discussed openly. When you step back and take in the whole picture, the weight of these 10 sayings is impossible to ignore. They're not just strange lines buried in an ancient text. They're statements that shaped a religion, molded cultures, and continue to ripple through the lives of millions today. Each one on its own might be explained away. Maybe hate your family is just a figure of speech. Maybe cut off your hand is only symbolic. Maybe kill my enemies is just a story. But when you put them all together, the pattern is undeniable. These are not the words of someone guiding people toward freedom and compassion. They are the words of someone tightening a grip, demanding loyalty, and instilling fear. And that's why the cult framework fits so neatly. This isn't just a clever comparison. It's a recognition that the very dynamics we warn people about in modern destructive groups were alive and well in the earliest teachings of Christianity. The psychological hooks were planted in the soil from the beginning. What's more, the aftershocks of these sayings still define how Christianity operates. The demand for absolute loyalty fuels division between believers and non-believers. The threat of punishment keeps people in line. The promise of reward keeps them striving. And the devaluation of ordinary life, family ties, personal fulfillment, bodily integrity, ensures that devotion is always placed above the self. It's easy to see how powerful this formula is. It's not just about belief, it's about control, about shaping lives, bending wills, and keeping entire communities bound to a central authority. And the fact that these sayings are still repeated, memorized, and preached every week means the system continues to reproduce itself endlessly. The irony is that the same figure presented as the ultimate symbol of love also spoke words that undercut love at its most basic level. Love of family, love of self, love of life. All of it had to be secondary to devotion to him. That's not love freely given. That's love demanded under threat. And once you see it, it becomes clear that the reputation doesn't match the reality. None of this requires cynicism or mockery. It simply requires honesty, a willingness to take the words at face value, without centuries of excuses and reinterpretations, to ask what they actually say, what they actually mean, and what kind of system they actually build. And the answer is uncomfortable but unavoidable. These are the hallmarks of a leader who sought control above all else. That recognition opens the door to a larger question. If these are the foundations, what does that say about the house built on top of them? If the central figure of a major religion spoke words that line up so closely with cult tactics, what does that mean for the countless people who have devoted their lives to him? It means that the pain, division, and fear so many have felt are not accidents or distortions. They're the direct fruit of the teachings themselves. And that's why this conversation matters. Because when you strip away the reverence, the traditions, the excuses, and the centuries of Polish, what remains is not a harmless collection of sayings. It's a blueprint for control, a pattern that has repeated again and again, leaving broken lives in its wake. The challenge with talking about these sayings is that so many people have been trained to excuse them. They've been told since childhood that Jesus could never be wrong, that every word has a hidden meaning, that every command is actually love in disguise. But the mental gymnastics required to make these verses look harmless is itself a sign of how deeply the system grips people, because if these words were spoken by anyone else, no one would hesitate to call them dangerous. If a modern leader told followers to hate their families, abandon funerals, mutilate themselves, and obey or face destruction, we'd see the red flags instantly. We'd call it coercion, manipulation, and abuse, and we'd warn people to stay away. Yet, with Jesus, the same words are dressed in reverence. They're quoted as wisdom, embroidered on church banners, and taught to children as holy truth. And in that disguise, they become even more powerful, because the manipulation goes unnoticed. The cage is built out of verses that people are taught to love. The consequences stretch across centuries. Families estranged because one member dared to question the faith. Children raised in fear of eternal punishment. People sacrificing their dreams, their bodies, and their very sense of self to meet impossible demands. These are not accidents or distortions. They're the logical outcomes of taking the saying seriously. And when you compare the words to the cult framework, the alignment is precise. Exclusive loyalty, isolation from family, fear-based obedience, threats of punishment, promises of reward. These aren't traits of freedom or enlightenment. They're the traits of control. That realization doesn't just change how we see the past. It also matters for the present, because the same words are still shaping minds today, still being preached from pulpits, still being memorized in Sunday schools, still being quoted as the highest truth, which means the same dynamics of fear, guilt, and dependency are being reproduced in generation after generation. The power of these 10 sayings lies in their honesty, not the honesty of wisdom, but the honesty of exposure. They reveal the kind of system Jesus was building. They show that the movement wasn't about freeing people, but binding them. And once you recognize that, the entire narrative of Jesus as a purely loving, liberating figure collapses under the weight of his own words. What remains is uncomfortable, but liberating in its own way. Because once you see the control for what it is, you can finally step outside of it. You can measure the sayings not against tradition, but against reason, compassion, and the kind of freedom that doesn't need threats or promises to hold people. And in that light, the verdict becomes clear. The 10 worst things Jesus ever said don't reveal divine wisdom. They reveal the unmistakable blueprint of a cult leader. Looking back at these words, what's most striking is how different they are from the image so many people hold in their minds. The gentle shepherd, the healer, the voice of love. That picture fades quickly when compared to the actual sayings. The contrast is sharp, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. Because here's the reality. Words matter. They shape lives, guide choices, and carve entire cultures. And the words we've walked through are not harmless phrases from an ancient book. They're commands that demand sacrifice, divide families, inspire fear, and tighten control. For generations, these sayings have been softened, explained away, or buried under layers of interpretation. But strip those away, and what's left is clear and raw. Commands that fit the profile of a leader who sought absolute loyalty at any cost. A voice that silenced doubt with threats, demanded obedience above love, and built a system where fear was the foundation. That system grew into one of the most powerful religions in human history. It spread across continents, shaped governments, dictated laws, and claimed authority over billions of lives. And at the core of it all are words that look less like wisdom and more like the playbook of a cult leader. For those willing to see it, the lesson is simple. We don't need threats of fire to live moral lives. We don't need to abandon our families to find meaning. We don't need to cut off our hands or hate ourselves to grow as human beings. Real compassion doesn't demand obedience. Real wisdom doesn't inspire fear. And real freedom never requires blind devotion. So, when we weigh the legacy of Jesus' words, the verdict isn't found in sermons or traditions. It's found in the impact they have had. And that impact is written in broken families, guilty consciences, silenced doubts, and centuries of control. That's not the fruit of love. That's the mark of a system built on fear and obedience. And once you recognize that, the power of those words begins to fade. They lose their grip, they stop sounding holy, and start sounding exactly like what they are: demands that belong not to a savior, but to a cult leader. That's where we leave it. 10 sayings that cut through centuries of myth. 10 sayings that reveal the truth hiding in plain sight. The words themselves are enough. They speak louder than any sermon, and they tell a story that has been waiting all along to be heard.